this is the Folksy Friend, and on this channel I like to talk about stories. In particular, folk tales, beliefs, and mythologies. Today we are talking about a fairy tale. The story, The Wild Swans, is about how the bond of familial love can overcome even the most hopeless and painful of circumstances. It is also a wonderful example of a brave and steadfast princess who does the saving all on her own. This fairy tale was one of the stories compiled by Hans Christian Andersen, published in 1838 in his book, Fairy Tales Told for Children. So, once upon a time there was a kingdom, and in this kingdom there lived a king who loved his 12 children. He had 11 magnificent sons and 1 lovely daughter. They lived a life of luxury. They wanted for nothing, and they were good children. They worked hard, they were valiant, and they enjoyed all the best their wealth had to offer. Until one day the king decides to remarry, and he remarries a wicked queen. A queen who also has some magic tendencies that are not on the fairy godmother side. In fact, the children learn just how wicked their new stepmother is the very first day that she's in their home. During the wedding feast of her and their father, they are enjoying baked apples and other cakes and treats, as they usually do. But their stepmother went around, taking the sweets from them, and instead giving them each a single teacup filled with sand. And she told them to pretend that this teacup was full of their most delicious treats, because they were not going to have any more. The very next week, she had the daughter, Alyssa, sent away to the countryside to live with peasants, and then began to get to work spreading lies and wicked rumors to the king about his sons. And she did this until he began to want nothing to do with them. Finally, when he completely lost interest in his own children, she ran to them and screeched, "Fly out into the world to make your own living. Fly away as birds without voice." And she meant to do more harm with her spell than actually occurred, because they turned into 11 magnificent swans and flew away from the palace. They went straight to the cottage where their sister was sleeping, but because she had cursed them to have no voice, they could only flap their wings and try to wake her. When that didn't work, they were forced to fly away. They stopped in a great dark forest near the sea. Alyssa spent her days making the best of things. She played with a leaf as her only toy, and thought about her brothers and how much she missed them. One day the wind swirled around the cottage and asked the roses, "Who is prettier than you?" And the roses replied, "Alyssa." Then the wind went to the peddler who was at the door reading the family psalms and asked the book, "Who is more righteous than you?" And the book replied, "Alyssa." When she turned 15, Alyssa was sent back to the palace, and her stepmother greeted her. She was dismayed and furious to find that Alyssa had grown into a beautiful young woman. The sight of the young girl filled her with such hatred and spite, she wanted to turn her into a swan immediately. But she knew the king wanted to see her, so she couldn't risk doing away with her just yet. That night, while Alyssa slept, the wicked queen took 3 toads. The wicked queen kissed the first toad and told it to sit on top of Alyssa's head to make her feel addled and lethargic. Then she kissed the second toad and told it to fix itself to Alyssa's forehead. Then she kissed the second toad and told it to fix itself to Alyssa's forehead, that it would make her so ugly that she would be unrecognizable. Finally, she kissed the third toad and told it to fix itself above Alyssa's heart, and it would fill her with dark desires that would torment her. The toads were tossed into the bath, and the wicked queen sent for Alyssa. She made Alyssa get into the water, and immediately the toads jumped upon her, but because of the magic, Alyssa didn't seem to notice. However, nothing happened. Alyssa bathed, and then she stood, and when she stood, in the water floated 3 poppies. She was too good and pure of heart, and the evil magic had not worked against her. Furious, the wicked queen thought quickly and came up with a plan B. She took Alyssa, pretending to help her get ready, and smeared walnut paste across her skin, staining it dark. then covered her with a vile ointment to disguise her face. Fair warning, this story is a product of its time and 100% contains casual racism implying that dark skin is ugly. Just saying, obviously not okay, but there it is. Then the wicked queen messed up her beautiful hair and dragged her before the king. The king looked at the girl and was horrified, saying that there was no way this could be his daughter, and ordered her removed from the throne room. Broken-hearted, Alyssa left the palace altogether. She began to wander around the marshes and the fields, not knowing where to go or what to do. Eventually, she thought that this must have been what happened to her brothers, that something had happened to drive them away from the palace, and now she wanted to try to find them. So she kept walking until she reached a forest, then went in to find somewhere to sleep. Alyssa lay her head on some soft moss, then watched in amazement as fireflies lit up the forest around her. That night, she dreamt of her brothers, how they had been in the past, and it was almost like they were a part of one of her old storybooks. She woke late the next day, around noon, and realized that from where she was, she could hear water running. Again? Alyssa followed the sound until she found a clear pool and finally saw her reflection for the first time, seeing that her skin had been stained and was smeared with ointment that disguised her appearance. So she cleaned herself off, brushed out her hair, and got dressed, then set about trying to find her brothers. She had a deep faith and trusted that God would lead her in the right direction. Following her instincts, she came across an apple tree and was grateful to have food to eat. Then she went deeper into the forest, so far in that the air became close and dark, and she no longer saw or heard any animals. She felt very alone that night, and when she lay down, there were no fireflies to light up around her. Then, as she was drowsing, she suddenly felt as though the trees above her opened, and God himself smiled down at her, surrounded by his angels, and she fell asleep. When she woke the next morning, she wasn't sure if it had been a dream or if it had really happened. So Alyssa got up and began her wandering again. She came across an old woman who was foraging for berries and was grateful when the woman gave her some. She asked this woman if she had seen Okay, you need to stop. Thank you. She asked the woman if she had seen 11 young men anywhere near the forest, and the woman replied that no, she hadn't seen 11 young men, but curiously, just yesterday she had seen 11 swans swimming in the river. Overjoyed, Alyssa asked the woman for help, and the woman led her to the river. From there, Alyssa followed it down to the coast. When she reached the sea, seeing it for the first time in her life, she became overwhelmed by the vast expanse of water and just didn't know where to go from there. But she looked down at the stones beneath her feet and saw how the waves were unrelenting, rolling the large stones until they became smooth and beautiful. And in that moment, Alyssa promised herself that she would be just as tireless and dedicated as the very waves of the sea, and she would keep going until she found her brothers. She stayed along the coast and even found some long white feathers, and that evening she looked up to see 11 magnificent swans flying towards her. Alyssa went and hid behind the trees, watching from a distance as the swans landed. Just as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the swans seemed to throw off their feathers, and in their place stood 11 young men. And although they were grown and looked different, Alyssa recognized them immediately. She burst out from her hiding place and ran to them, overjoyed. They traded stories explaining what had happened to them in the past years. Her eldest brother told her that they were cursed to be swans by day and men by night. They always had to be sure that they were on the ground when the sun dipped below the horizon, or else they would fall out of the sky. He also told her that they were only allowed to return to their homeland, where she was, once a year, and only for 11 days. He said that their new home was across the sea, a 2-day journey that was very difficult, and forced them to spend one night huddled on a very small rock in the middle of the sea, but that every year their homeland called to them, and they made the journey so they could fly to the palace and see their old home, and see the churchyard where their mother was buried, and all the familiar sights, and they had hoped one day to see her again. Now she was there, they wanted to take her with them. They just didn't know how. They spoke all through the night until eventually Alyssa fell asleep. The next morning she awoke to find all but her youngest brother had flown away, and the youngest one stayed with her to keep her company throughout the day. That night, when their other brothers returned, they discussed what they should do and decided that they would take Alyssa with them. So they set about creating a net made of bark and rushes that would be strong enough to carry her across the ocean. At dawn, she went to sleep in the net, and when she awoke, they were carrying her high up in the sky. When the sun became too strong, one of them would fly above her, shielding her from its heat. However, because of the added weight of carrying their sister, they were flying slower than they normally did, and when the sun started to go down, they still were not at their overnight resting place. They began to fly faster, almost out of desperation, and Alyssa started to panic because she couldn't see the rock anywhere. All of a sudden, the swans began to dive, and Alyssa screamed, thinking that they were transforming back. Then she saw a tiny rock, seeming to her to be no bigger than the head of a seal, and they reached it in the nick of time. The sun set, and all 11 turned back into humans, linking their arms quickly to avoid falling in the sea. That night, around them raged a terrible storm, thunder and lightning shaking the skies, and waves crashing all around them. They huddled together and sang, trying to keep up their courage. The next day they set out again, carrying Alyssa in her little net. As they went along, she saw what she thought was a palace floating above the clouds, with palm trees and great open land. But as they got close, she realized that it was nothing more than a sea mirage. Several of these passed until eventually they reached real land, a mountainous, forested area that the brothers had come to call home. They took Alyssa to a cave and set her down, just before they turned back into humans once more. Exhausted, they all went to sleep, telling Alyssa they hoped she had good dreams, but she hoped that she would dream of a way to save them. That night, Alyssa dreamed of the palace from the sea mirage, and in her dream, a fairy came from the palace to speak to her, and the fairy looked very similar to the old woman in the woods who had told her about the swans. This fairy was holding a nettle, which she showed to Alyssa, and told her that there was a way her brothers could be free, but Alyssa would suffer great physical pain, heartache, and anguish. The fairy asked Alyssa if she still wanted to undertake this task, and Alyssa said that she did. The curse could be broken if Alyssa took the nettles, specifically ones that either grew around the cave where she was, or on top of graves in churchyards. Only those nettles would do. Alyssa would have to pick them, even though they would burn her hands, then stomp them into flax, even though it would burn her feet. From that flax, she would have to weave 11 shirts with long sleeves. If you've never touched a stinging nettle before, it hurts. Once the shirts were finished, she would have to throw them atop each of her brothers, and they would transform back into humans. But here was the biggest catch. Once she decided and began this task, she could not speak a single word until it was complete. If she spoke, her brothers would all drop dead. Once again, the fairy asked her if she was sure she wanted to do this, and Alyssa said that she was. The fairy reached out and touched her with the nettle, and the sudden searing pain woke Alyssa from her dream. When she opened her eyes, she found that that same nettle was growing just a few feet away. Seeing it as a sign, she sat up and began the task. Pulling up the nettles, her hands began to burn and her arms blistered, but she pushed through the pain and kept working. That night, when her brothers returned, they were horrified to see her injuries and afraid by the way that she would not speak to them. But she gestured, pointing to them and the nettles, and tried to make them understand. And they came to understand a little that what she was doing was for them. The youngest one went to her and began to weep, and his tears fell on her hands, healing the burns. and taking away her pain. Days passed with the same schedule, and eventually she had finished the first shirt, began work on the second. That's when she heard the blare of a hunting horn, and terrified, gathered up her work and hid in the cave. She bundled up all her nettles and the finished shirt and sat on them to protect them, hiding her hands under her apron. Soon dogs came running out of the forest, clearly drawn by her scent, and after them came a group of large men. Terrified, Alyssa did not move, but the most handsome of the men among them came forward and knelt in front of her. He told her that he was the king of these lands and asked how she had ended up way up in the mountains in this cave. Of course, she couldn't answer, so she said nothing. Then he told her that he just couldn't leave her there, so he picked her up. Despite her tears and her resistance, he set her on his horse, jumped on top, and began the journey back to his castle. He told her that he hoped someday she could understand. He was only trying to help her. He couldn't leave her in that state. All Alyssa could do was cry. When they reached his city, Alyssa was greeted by beautiful sights, marble fountains, and great tall buildings, but she could care less. In the palace, she allowed women to dress her up in finery, to clean her off, brush her hair, and braid it with pearls, and then finally put gloves over her injured hands. Then they led her to the throne room, and the whole court was astounded to see such a beautiful woman among them. The king announced immediately that he would take this beautiful young woman for his bride, and the court was happy. But the archbishop beside him whispered in the king's ear that this was a bad idea. He had found this woman just in the woods, in a cave, doing Lord knows what, that she must be a witch, and she must have cast a spell on him and the court to love and accept her. The king didn't listen. He took Alyssa by the hand and brought her to a great feast. He ordered dancers and entertainment, had her fed the best foods, but no matter what he tried, she only looked solemn and sad. He tried showing her his great gardens and halls, his many rooms filled with paintings, but no matter what he did, she didn't smile. Finally, he took her back to her room and then opened a door off to the side, and Alyssa found there was a small room attached to hers that had been decorated to look like the cave they'd found her in. There were green tapestries on the walls, and on the ground she found a pile of her nettles, and the shirt she had made was hung up for her. Alyssa was floored. She was overjoyed to see her hard work, but she was also deeply touched that he cared enough to have done this for her. So she turned, took his hand, and kissed it, as her only way of showing her thanks and appreciation. And when they left the room, the king ordered for the church bells to be rung, announcing their wedding. The archbishop continued to whisper evil, cruel words to the king, trying to turn his mind from Alyssa, but nothing seemed to get through. The king was deeply in love. At the wedding ceremony, the archbishop himself had to place the crown on Alyssa's head. He pushed it down too far so that it would injure her on purpose, but the pain she felt in her heart for the fate of her brothers was greater than any physical pain, and it didn't bother her. Alyssa would sneak out of bed every night and go into the little room, working tirelessly on the shirts for her brothers. Day by day, the king continued to do things to make her happy. He seemed to genuinely want her to find joy, and she found herself falling a little more in love with him every day. There came a point where she truly wished with all her heart that she could confide in him and tell him her struggles and what she was doing, what she still had to do. But she couldn't. She knew that any word she spoke would be the death of her brothers. After she finished the 6th shirt, she ran out of nettles. So, in order to start the 7th, she had to go find more. That night, she crept out of bed and left the castle entirely, going to the nearest churchyard. When she opened the gate, she could see a circle of vampires sitting among the gravestones, and watched as a ghoul dug up a body and began to devour it. Alyssa was absolutely terrified, but she trusted in her faith in the Lord, said a prayer, and entered the churchyard. She was able to get her nettles and run back without being injured. However, the archbishop, who really has it out for Alyssa, was a very light sleeper, and he saw her that night. Seeing the queen slip into the graveyard made him all the more convinced that she was a witch or some other manner of evil creature. The next day at confessional, the archbishop told the king what he had seen. All around them in the church, the images of saints began to shake their heads at his words, trying to decry Alyssa's innocence. But the archbishop told the king that the saints were shaking their heads because they were saddened by Alyssa's wickedness, and that it was proof that he was telling the truth. So from that night onward, the king would pretend to fall asleep, then watch as Alyssa would sneak out of their bed and go into the small room. Night after night it happened, and they began to grow distant in their waking hours. He began to withdraw from her and look sad. Alyssa didn't understand why he was pulling away, and she couldn't ask, so she also became sad. Her only real comfort in life was starting to desert her. Finally, there was only one shirt left, but once again, she had run out of nettles. So Alyssa snuck out again in the dead of night to the churchyard. This time, both the king and the archbishop followed. They saw her slip in through the gate, but because they were behind, they didn't see her duck behind the graves to pick her nettles. When their heads entered the gate, they only saw the vampires and the ghouls, and the king was convinced that she must be among them. He was completely heartbroken at the idea that his beloved Alyssa was one of these evil creatures and that she had somehow deceived him. So he told the archbishop that he would allow his people to decide the fate of their queen. And the people decided that she was to be put to death by fire. Alyssa was taken to the dungeon, and there she found that she had been given her most recent pile of nettles as a pillow and the shirts as blankets, meant to be a punishment and injure her, but of course she was delighted to see that her work was there, and she continued desperately working on the last shirt. Late that afternoon, she heard wings beating outside her window and saw that the youngest brother had found her at last. But then the archbishop came, telling her that he had promised the king he would spend her last few hours with her, praying if she wanted. Alyssa immediately began aggressively motioning him to get out, and he did, mumbling some very cruel things under his breath. But she ignored him. She knew she only had a few hours left to complete the work, or all of the suffering will have been for nothing, and her brothers would remain swans for the rest of their lives. The mice along the floor helped gather her nettles up for her, and a thrush sang at her window, giving her peace and some kind of courage. At dawn, just before the sunrise, her brothers showed up at the palace gates and demanded to be let in to see the king. The guards tried to turn them away, but the brothers were so insistent and loud and caused such a ruckus that the king himself woke up and went to see what was going on. Unfortunately, he took just a little bit too long. As he arrived down at the gates, the sun rose, and off flew 11 magnificent swans. A cart was sent to bring Alyssa to the pyre in the middle of the city, and she went in, feverishly working on the final shirt, the other 10 stacked up beside her. A great crowd had gathered to watch their queen burn to death, and when they saw she was working with strange plants and muttering under her breath, they didn't realize that she was whispering a prayer to keep herself calm. They thought that she must be working on her witchcraft and demanded that she stop what she was doing. They surged forward and tried to snatch the shirts away from her and destroy them. But as they did, her brothers came flying down and surrounded the cart in a flock of swans. Some people thought then that she must be innocent, that these swans were a sign from God, and that somehow they were all mistaken. No one was brave enough to speak out in the crowd. The cart reached the pyre, and the executioner reached down to grab Alyssa's arm. In her last desperate moment, she threw the shirts out, and the swans dove at them, instantly transforming back into 11 handsome young men. Except for the youngest, Alyssa had not been able to finish the last sleeve on the last shirt, and so his arm remained that of a swan's wing. Alyssa cried out that her task was complete, and now she could speak her truth, defend herself, that she was innocent. and the people all around began to bow down as if they had seen a saint. Despite seeing that they believed her, the stress and the anguish and the pain was just too much, and Alyssa collapsed. Her eldest brother then stood up on the platform and announced to the crowd their story, telling them of their curse and how their sister had toiled endlessly for years trying to save them. As he spoke, the massive pyre they had meant to burn Alyssa on began to grow branches and roses, rising high up as if it were a hedge, and at the very top bloomed a single white flower. The king took this flower and brought it down to Alyssa, laying it over her heart. And in that moment she was revived. Suddenly the church bells all began to ring, with no one pulling the ropes, and birds filled the air. Procession back to the castle was glorious. And that was The Wild Swans. The story has been adapted into films, television, songs, and even a comic. Although there is no resolution, we don't ever find that the Wicked Queen was punished, the ending is still satisfying because we see that all of what Alyssa suffered comes to fruition and her brothers are saved from their curse. It seems more important in this case for good to triumph over evil by good just getting to be free and live their lives. We don't necessarily need to see evil destroyed to be happy for Alyssa and her brothers. I hope you enjoyed this story. I really love it. Alyssa's tenacity and just her absolute dedication to the task, the way she never falters, is just it's inspiring, honestly. Let me know what you think in the comment section. Do you like Alyssa? Do you wish that we could have seen some justice done on the evil queen? I kind of wonder what happened to their father. Who's going to take over that kingdom? Well, let me know what you think. Thanks for being here, and I will see you next week.